There are three phases to the FOIA process. The first one is the request phase. That's where a person makes a written request to a FOIA officer asking for records over a specific period of time and hopefully a specific geography. That's the first part of the request process, but that doesn't end there, because when a federal agency receives your request, then they have certain duties. One is they have 20 working days from the receipt of the request to give you a determination of whether they're going to give you records or not. What I found in recent years is they don't do that. They don't give you a determination, but they usually will give you a reference number. This reference number, often called a FOIA number, reference number, case number, file number. This number is a number that is attached to your request and stays with your request for the entirety of the entire FOIA process. Very important number. Keep track of it and always use that number when communicating with the agency. When am I going to get my records? When am I going to get my records? Your job as a FOIA requester is just not sit there and wait for the agency to do something. You want to make sure you use a process we call the estimated completion date. And that's where you, as the requester, have the right to ask the agency, what is the estimated completion date on my request? You write that letter, you write that email, you send it, make sure you have that reference number on there. And that is part of the back and forth process during this whole request thing. Another thing that will come up is, do you want to narrow your request? Federal agencies are allowed to ask you one time if you want to narrow your request. What does that mean, narrow request? Well, what if you forgot to say the period of time for your request? Well, now you get that chance to narrow your request. We only want the records for the last 3 years, not the last 23 years. That's an example of narrowing your request after you've made it. Now, after you finish the request period, back and forth, and let's just say they gave you a few records, but they didn't give you all the records you thought you were going to get, they send you what is called a final determination letter. And that determination letter kicks off the next phase, which is called the administrative appeal phase. Now, the letter that you get that says, here are some records, we're not going to give you other records, it contains a magic paragraph called the 90-day notice paragraph. And that 90 days is, you have 90 days, not 90 working days, but 90 actual calendar days to submit your administrative appeal. Do you need a lawyer to do your request? No, if you can follow the instructions. Do you need a lawyer to do your administrative appeal? Well, now it's beginning to get a little more technical, but the answer is no. You don't need a lawyer to do the administrative appeal, and you must file that administrative appeal, usually by certified mail, return receipt requested, within that 90-day period. And what are you going to be saying in your administrative appeal? You're going to be saying that the government agency made 2 errors. And they always make these 2 errors. And even if they haven't made the 2 errors, it's a good idea to raise both of these issues. One, they failed to adequately search for the records. And 2, they applied one of the 9 Freedom of Information Act exemptions in a way that stopped you from getting your records. Now, what kicks off the third and final phase of the FOIA process? Well, hopefully by now you've gotten all your records and you're happy and you don't need to call a lawyer. But for the next phase, the judicial review phase, you will need a licensed lawyer, licensed in the court where the lawsuit is going to be filed, and it will be a lawsuit against the federal agency on behalf of you as the requester who didn't get their records. Now, how quickly can you file that judicial review? You can file it within 20 working days after they received your request. Way back at the beginning, you could file it that early. What about the latest that you could file it? The answer is 6 years from that initial 20-day period. What if you made an administrative appeal and they're sitting on that for years? Can you bring a judicial review? Answer, yes. When? You can do that within 20 days, working days, of their receipt of your administrative appeal. So the judicial review process, once you've gone through the hoops of showing the court that you have, we call it, exhausted your administrative remedies. You've done everything you could without a lawyer. Now you're filing in federal court. Now, what federal court could you file in? Well, FOIA says you have the right to file in one of 3 courts. You can file in the district where you live. So if you live in Maryland, you can file in the District of Maryland. If you live in Wyoming, you can file in the District of Wyoming. You can also file, the law says, where the records are. Well, if you know these records are in St. Louis, Missouri, which is a federal record storage facility, you could file in the Eastern District of Missouri. And finally, FOIA says you can always file in the United States District Court for the District of Columbia in Washington, D.C. And that's the court I'm licensed in, and that's the court that I file all of my judicial reviews in. Why? Because it's the only court specifically mentioned by the Freedom of Information Act where disputes over FOIA matters can be wrestled with and ultimately determined. That court, I find, handles about half of all the FOIA matters in the country, and it is one of the most experienced courts at handling FOIA issues. And what we do is we handle the judicial reviews and we go about the process of getting people records in that court. Now, I'm going to briefly talk about the phases within that judicial review. First phase is we file the case. It's called a complaint. It attaches your request and your administrative appeal, if you did one, and anything the government of importance the government has given you. And then it says that the government has failed to do one of 2 things, or both of 2 things. 1, they failed to adequately search for the records, and 2, they inappropriately applied one of the 9 FOIA exemptions. We then get a briefing schedule if the government disagrees. If they agree, they just simply provide the records over time. If they disagree, we have a briefing schedule, and the judge ends up deciding. And remember, in FOIA, it's an administrative law. There's no trial, there's no jury, there's no going to Washington, D.C. It's all on paper. And the judge then makes a decision about whether the agency has to give more records. We just won a case recently where the government had failed to give the records. The judge agreed with us, ordered them to give the records in 2 weeks. So that's an example of taking it through the process. And then finally, at the end of the judicial review, assuming that you've won, there is the matter of who pays for all this. Because if you have been paying your lawyer, do you get your money back? And the answer is maybe. And that's what we call the attorney fee phase of the judicial review. That's when the judge decides whether or not the fees should be paid by the government or everyone should bear their own fees. And there's a lot more I can say about that, but those are the phases of the FOIA process. So if you have questions on how to navigate the FOIA process, please feel free to give me a call and I'd be happy to talk with you.